This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini. I have two experts, Peter Bondinella and Frank Burke, who will talk about his life and career, and the conversation will begin when we return. The subject is Federico Fellini, one of the most famous filmmakers of the 20th century. And the two gentlemen that you see are experts on his life and career. On the left, you see Frank Burke. On the right is Peter Bondinella. As I usually do, I like to give the guests a few minutes to introduce themselves, their backgrounds, and also what drew them to the subject matter. So, Frank, let me start with you. If you could just do that, give a little bit of a bio of yourself and what drew you to Fellini's work, and if you have any books or anything on him.
Okay, well, I grew up in New York City. I went to graduate school in Florida, and I was in an English department, and but had the good fortune to have a thesis advisor who was interested in European film at the time. So I was able to write my PhD dissertation on Fellini, which for the English department to allow that was extraordinarily open-minded for the time. I was attracted to Fellini and sort of in those days as an auteur, as the equivalent in a sense of Joyce or Hemingway or the major auteurs that I had been studying within literature. I think on a personal level, I was also attracted to him because I was raised Irish Catholic and sort of I was questioning Catholicism, and Fellini became my new religion in a certain sense, in that he was reworking Catholicism in terms of his own sort of interest in psychology and from the secular point of view. So I think that briefly was the attraction, part of my attraction to Fellini at the time. Since then, I've published 3 books in English on Fellini, one on his early films, one on his whole cinematic career, and then also I've co-authored a book with Marguerite Waller, who unfortunately was supposed to join us today but couldn't, contemporary perspectives on Fellini. I've contributed to a volume on his work in Italy as well, and I did do the Amarcord commentary for Criterion Film with Peter Brunette.
Before I move on to Peter, since you had mentioned the early film studies, I know most of that came out of the English departments, and I guess in the 1950s, Fellini and Bergman and Kurosawa were, I guess, the 3 big names there. Was that so? That's at least what we get the impression of nowadays when we look back on that in the burgeoning film departments. Was Fellini as big a name as generally accorded, or is that something that's just in the rear view been posited?
No, I think, well, I mean, my experience was Fellini, Bergman, Antonioni, and Kurosawa, and okay. We're talking now sort of mid-'60s. So whereas the art film movement started in the '50s, I think the sort of incorporation of filmmakers into English department curricula started in the sort of the mid-1960s. But those were the 4 biggest figures. And of course, then from a political point of view, there was the French New Wave as well, so Truffaut and Godard. So there, I would add those 2 figures as well.
Peter Bondinella, you've also done some commentaries on Fellini discs. If you could give a little bio about yourself as well.
Sure. Well, I have a totally different background from Frank's, whose background is also very unusual. He's absolutely right to say that the English department was very forward-looking and allowing him to write on Fellini in an English department. I actually started out at Davidson College in political science and French. I spent my junior abroad in France and Italy and Spain, and I thought I was going to become a diplomat or I had some silly idea about that. I wasn't at Georgetown. Nobody bothered to send me the memo that if you wanted to be a diplomat, you go to Georgetown instead of a Southern college in North Carolina. But anyway, I managed to end up with a background in language and comparative literature, and then in Italian and comparative literature. And when I went to my first job, I got the idea that it would be a good idea but this was, by the way, the very first of the '70s, so I'm a little behind time with Frank's interest in Fellini. I got a fellowship in 1972 and basically went to Paris and spent about 3 months doing nothing but watching Italian movies. So I didn't have I never went to a school that had a film program. Davidson certainly didn't at that time, although they do now. And so it was kind of, roll your own time in my case. Although it was a great place to do it. I walked into a retrospective of 45 Italian cinema, films, classics in one place, and spent literally every day not doing what I was supposed to be doing, but watching movies. So how I got into Italian cinema, and Fellini in particular, was that I just thought it was crazy that, Italian departments weren't teaching Italian cinema. After all, everybody speaks Italian in Italian films. I mean, why not do it? So I started doing that, and eventually it led to a book on Italian cinema, history of Italian cinema. And then the major thing I did, well, the first thing I did actually was a reflection of that early auteur interest, because Oxford contracted with me a book of essays on Fellini way back in the 70s. And the other people they did was Bergman and Kurosawa. And the series ended with those three, unfortunately. They did other film books later, but that sort of gives you an idea of what people were interested in at the time in publishing. And so I went on to write a book on Fellini at Princeton, which was actually, I was very lucky to have a preface by Fellini in there. And I did another book on a shorter book on Fellini some years later, and then just and another collection of essays. The Fellini book at Princeton actually is done, pretty well. It was translated into Chinese and is about to be translated into Turkish as well as Italian. So I have two translations, neither of which I can read. I hope they do a good job. But all of this reflects, I think, both Frank and I sort of came to the interest in Fellini in general and Italian film as well, in a kind of roundabout way that of course doesn't happen anymore. I mean, people go to film departments and go to Italian departments, and they do that now as a matter of course. But I think it was a lot more fun doing the way we did, actually, to be perfectly honest. I don't know what I think it was, because we did what we liked, and I think that was one of the great things about it.
Well, Frank had mentioned the New Wave movement. I want to step back, though, to the World War II and the Italian neorealism, which was the movement in Italy that came directly after the war. And also I want to talk a little bit about Fellini's background specifically. But let's talk a little bit about the war in Italy, what Fellini was doing when Italy flipped sides. And then, you have the whole movement with Rossellini and De Sica, the Rome Open City, this neorealistic movement that Fellini comes out of. And if you look, Italy and Japan had great film cultures in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Germany didn't. What do you think accounts for the burgeoning of the filmic culture in Italy after the war?
If you're asking me,
either of you.
You need to start before the war, even, because much of the Italian film culture came out with you might start by talking about two journals in Italy that were pre-war journals. One was sponsored by the official regime. It was called Cinema, and it was run by Mussolini's son, Vittorio. And the people who after the war became the ideologues of the Italian cinema, or the people who were at least left wing and thought of cinema as a social force that was going to change the world, came out of that, interestingly enough. They were fascists to begin with, most of them. The other journal, where Fellini comes from, and where my other favorite director, Ettore Scola, who just died very recently, came from, was a humor magazine from Rome, Mark Aurelius, named after the famous Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius. And they were just the opposite. They were sort of, they were all sketch artists. They were gag artists. They were script writers. I mean, and they were the sort of the crazy, kind of surrealistic side of Italian cinema, which Fellini was part of. And it seems to me that as you go forward, what you have is a kind of dialogue between these two magazines, if you will. On the one hand, you have the Antonionis and the Viscontis on the left, really. Not left really politically, but sort of left aesthetically, who believe that, you can change the world with cinema. On the right, you had people like Fellini that were interested in throwing custard pies and other kinds of cinema. So, I mean, you have a kind of strange sort of mixture, and they all bubble up after the war because all of a sudden, the fascist censorship is over, and the world has changed, and people can more or less, and not, and sometimes less, say what they want in the cinema when they make a movie. So it was a very exciting time in many ways. But certainly, I think in the 20th century, in Italian culture, one of the most interesting times that existed. And Fellini came out of this really not as a filmmaker at all, but as a gag writer, as a sketch artist. And if you see Scola's recent film on Fellini about that period, you see very clearly that his ideas come out of visual culture more than comic books and all sorts of things like that, much more than political or ideological statements.
Yeah, I think it's also, Mussolini had established Cinecittà too in the 1930s, so there was, in the fascist era, there was a very strong commitment to film. That, fell apart for just physically in terms of the devastation of the Second World War, but there was a strong film culture within Italy, even largely on an institutional level as well, that probably didn't exist in Japan or Germany even at the same time. The other thing that's intriguing is how film really became the principal place for Italians to examine their own culture following the Second World War. And I don't know where that impetus came from, but Peter, neorealism became a way in which, along with the drafting of a new constitution, along with voting out the monarchy and voting in the republic, neorealism sort of played a very similar role in culturally, more so than literature at the time. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on how that came about?
Well, for one thing, I think that the film sort of replaced the vaudeville theater. In other words, Fellini really comes out of that vaudeville theater as well. He wrote gags and he did all sorts of things for it. But as the technology developed, and it's amazing how many theaters there actually were in Italy. The church had a whole circuit of theaters. Everybody had movie theaters. Now you go to Italy now, you start looking for film theaters, and it's kind of sad because you see all these abandoned old theaters. Some very nice new ones, multi-sala, as they call them, the same kind of things that we have with 5 or 6 different theaters going on at the same time. But this was really popular entertainment. Remember, what you had was vaudeville, the equivalent of vaudeville, movie theaters, and radio. That was entertainment.
With Anna Magnani and Aldo Fabrizi being in Rome Open City, so immediately we see two people from that sort of realm of entertainment entering into Italian film.
Yeah, they're just the opposite of dramatic actors. They're vaudeville actors. But they're cast, in a dramatic sort of situation, which was very against their roles, their normal roles. And cinema always does very well when they do that, actually. They mix up sort of expectations. But I think that the real problem with all this is that people forget also that there was a lot of opposition to neorealism in the official Christian democratic circles in particular. The leftists really wanted, leftist cinema. They wanted to change the world with cinema. But the Christian Democrats weren't so excited about that because, of course, they were worried about communists winning an election. And so it is true to say that Bicycle Thieves was the most communist film ever made in Italy, or somebody said that, so there's something to that effect. But that didn't mean that the government liked it, and it certainly didn't mean that they were willing to go out into the streets and change the world because of it. So I think that the Italians, remember there's also something also very important that people forget, that guess who were in Italy in 1943 to 1945, the English and the Americans. Let's forget about the French and the Moroccans and all those guys. They weren't that helpful. But the Americans and the English, once they were in Italy, if you look at the history of academics who had something to do with Italy from 1945 to 1970 and 80, and now have retired, a lot of those people were in Italy during the war, and they came to love the country. They came to see the Italians as unwitting victims, which is one of the things that the Italian cinema has very, very cleverly portrayed the Italian government as, a victim. Actually, it was much less of a victim than a participant in the war. And so there was a kind of positive feeling for Italy from the very beginning. People felt sorry for the Italians. They were really in bad shape in 1945. So that was Italian cinema. I think really helped to change. In other words, people had a really bad idea about the Japanese and the Germans, but the Italians got off the hook relatively early. Let's put it that way, in terms of like negative.
It was
remember,
mentioned.
there are also Italians who fought in Italy too.
Yeah,
Very different kind of situation.
it was mentioned about Mussolini's son being in charge of the film culture or the film ministry or whatever. I know I saw a documentary on Antonioni where it was said that Antonioni had great leeway to write things that the government didn't even disapprove of. This was not like Germany where Goebbels controlled everything. So I mean there was some I guess fostering of film culture beyond propaganda even under Mussolini's rule. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Luigi Freddi, we have his memoirs. Luigi Freddi, who was the head of the basically one of the big cheeses in the film industry, pretty much distinguished between propaganda films and entertainment. He wanted to compete with Hollywood. There was even Hal Roach even had a deal with Vittorio Mussolini going in Hollywood. They thought they were going to produce films together. So I mean, these guys wanted to make money. They wanted to have entertainment. They wanted to. That did not mean that they didn't do propaganda films. I mean, there are a number, but they're very few compared to Germany and Russia. Let's not forget Russia too, because the Italians looked at the Russian films from Soviet Russia. They looked at the German films, but they didn't really like that much that they saw. They wanted to have an industry that would compete, I think, commercially as well as nationally. So yes, you've got war film. What nation doesn't make a war film in which they root for their army? I mean, that's asking a lot, for somebody to make a war film in a country that's for the other side. Nobody does that, and you can't criticize a government for not doing that. But the Italian government really didn't have a stranglehold on the film industry. And Vittorio Mussolini was actually, remember, there's a left-wing fascism. There's not just a right-wing fascism. There's a left-wing fascism. And most of the intellectuals that were in the cinema were left-wing fascists. And after the war, they became communists.
I think also, I think the sort of general propaganda of fascist film was more about lifestyle. It was more about representing the country as doing well under fascism. So the overt propaganda was really minimal compared to that kind of lifestyle propaganda.
And mostly the real propaganda was in the newsreels, and that was separate. That was Luce, and you can still see these things. They're great. Actually, they're really interesting films. But that's where the propaganda was mostly in the newsreels. In the commercial films, there were very, very, very many really beautiful films. Actually, I mean, the fascist cinema. It's even bad to call it fascist cinema. It's really the cinema under fascism. That's more correct. I don't know if Frank would agree. I think that's absolutely.
Totally. Yeah.
Call it the other. It just makes it sound like Joseph Goebbels, and it's just not like that.
Now, Fellini was born to, I guess, middle-class background, and he seems to have, throughout his career, been sort of apolitical, more concerned with the quirks of humanity, especially mocking them, whether it's political, whether it's personal, whether it's the Roman Catholic Church. Coming out of the war and starting his career, as a screenwriter and working for other directors, were there hints of the future Fellini in some of his screenplays early on for other people?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that there's a kind of continuity with some of his themes. I mean, one of the major themes that you even find in his radio. He also wrote for radio programs. He wrote for Mark Aureli. He wrote a whole series of rubrics with his sign. He was actually, by the time he finished working for Marcus Aurelius, that humor magazine, he was one of the most famous writers in Italy, strangely enough. I mean, he had a huge following. Everybody read these things. Yeah. Nobody had any idea he was going to be a film director. And one of the major themes of all of these radio programs and these early little essays that he wrote were very sentimental sort of treatments of the loss of illusion. I think that's one of the great themes of early Fellini films. I mean, the idea that you fall in love and suddenly you're betrayed, or you're disappointed, or you have these silly romantic illusions about people as in the White Sheik, and they turn out to be just ridiculous. But Fellini not only shows you the ridiculous side, but also the pathetic and the kind of touching side of it. Well, that's all in those early radio programs and those early essays that he did, and so he sort of carries over those things from other media like radio and like humor magazines into these scripts that he writes. And then, of course, he actually works for the Luke's Film Studio, which was a very, very, very important studio, and one of those things that proves once again that what everybody says about neorealism is pretty much was in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s at least sort of nonsense, because this is a major studio that imitated Hollywood studios to the point of producers putting their feet up on desks and smoking big cigars to look like Hollywood, producers. Right? That's how they wanted to imitate Hollywood. And these guys were turning out neorealist films, which supposedly don't have anything to do with studios, as well as traditional dramas. So Fellini worked for these guys, and he worked with this whole mass of people that Frank was talking about that became of age in the fascist period. So that Italy really had this great assemblage of great cameramen and great script writers and terrific, as they do today, scenographers, set designers, costume designers. I mean, look at all the people that win Oscars, in Hollywood that are Italians in these things. Well, they still had them. They had them then, too. So
Centro Sperimentale was the foremost film school in the world, probably for many years leading up to neorealism as well. One thing I would mention too are the three, not only the scripts that Fellini wrote, but the three filmmakers he worked with. I think all influenced him that I'm aware of a lot. First of all, obviously Rossellini, with the kind of Christian humanism, but also the experimentation, the ability to create a movie on the spot instead of having it heavily scripted. Fellini was very influenced in filmmaking methods by Rossellini. Latuada's interest in women's stories, which then became La Strada and Nights of Cabiria and Juliet of the Spirits. And Jeremy, to me, is very much an American-style filmmaker, very interested in action-style shooting and within a kind of a Hollywood model. And I've always found Fellini attracted to American film in a way that I don't think is generally appreciated, but I think he loved American culture, and I think that his filmmaking style was heavily influenced by Jeremy's as well. So I think the people he worked with were important as well.
Well, you mentioned Alberto Latuada. He was the co-director on Variety Lights, the first film half film that Fellini's credited with, which later becomes the half of 8½. But it's very odd to really see nowadays, co-directors. Yeah, you have the Coen brothers now in modern Hollywood. Was that something that was something that wasn't that odd in Italy? Was Latuada was that Fellini's apprenticeship so that he could get backing for that film? How did that film come about?
Well, I think first of all, I think that you need to go back just a little bit, because Fellini did the script to a film called Senza Pietà, Without Pity, for Latuada, which is really it's actually a pretty courageous. It was about discrimination against Black American soldiers, in post-war Italy, so he had all of these people sort of, it's not quite as simple as just saying apprenticeship, because all these people work together and they were sort of interchangeable, and they go to dinner together, and they'd sit in a house and they'd write on a supper table, and they'd be passing scripts back and forth, and so I think people did at a certain point need the backing of somebody, but it was very often just by accident. It was just somebody suddenly couldn't do something, and so somebody else jumps into their place. Afterwards, of course, when Fellini became more famous than Latuada was definitely more famous than Fellini to begin with. And he's quite a wonderful director in his own right, and had a real reputation. And they sort of argued about who did what. But my feeling is always that Fellini's input into the script really is what makes the difference between between the first film being mostly Fellini's instead of half and half. It's he not only shot much of it, but he also scripted most of it. And that's something that I think Latoila didn't do on the first film. But who knows? I mean, that's the thing. We don't necessarily have all the documents. That's one of the problems with these things. That there's so many pieces of materials in the archives that are missing that we just don't always know that. I mean, I rescued some, but not all. And so Senza Pietà is one of those problem films. You try to figure out who actually did what on it. It's really hard. And you only have people's word on this, and then they forget, of course, what happened.
I think also picking up on what you're saying about, one of the things, co-directing wasn't that common, but the collaboration, scriptwriting collaboration was so important within Italy in a way that's really inconceivable, I think, in terms of Hollywood films, etc. As Peter was saying, these people are interchangeable. They work together all the time. So collaboration was a fundamental part of Italian filmmaking, which is hard for us, people who don't know Italian or whatever. It's difficult to really appreciate the contribution that scriptwriters that we don't really hear about have made. The other thing that's sort of linked to the collaborative element is Italy produced a lot of anthology films where you would have a film with 5 or 6 different directors. So we're not talking about co-directed films, but we are talking about a number of different people working on the same project. So I think those were quite fairly unusual in terms of the way in which we normally understand filmmaking, but they were important to Italian cinema.
Yeah, I don't think they sat around thinking I'm an auteur. I mean, that's exactly what they didn't think. I mean, there are even descriptions of some of these things. Well, you know this, Frank, as you work on the Peplum. Where they actually talk about. Well, we've got this scene with a gladiator. Upstairs they're doing another film about. Why don't you take this scene and take it up to them? They can use it up there. I mean, that sounds crazy, but that's actually what they're doing when they're making these things. Yeah. So nobody's sitting around with a little note card that says I'm a great director or I'm a great scriptwriter. That's one of the things that was so wonderful about it. It was this creative activity that didn't necessarily. In Hollywood, if anybody looks at something, they have to pay somebody to make sure that, they don't get sued. I mean, these guys were stealing stuff from each other right and left, and attributing things to people or not attributing to them that actually did important things. I mean, Fellini's, for instance, it's really it's a mystery, actually. Where Fellini actually shot his first shot. Some people say it's the famous episode in Paisan, in the Florence sequence where Rossellini was off with one of his girlfriends, and so Fellini had to cover for it. That's one place. But earlier, when he went in 1943, when he went to North Africa, there was a film that he helped script called The Last Tuaregs, which never got finished because the Allies defeated the Germans, and Fellini and everybody else had to escape. And perhaps he shot something in this film. And there's another one with Luigi Comencini that he actually helped to script. So, people just didn't write all this stuff down and didn't care that much about it. As long as you were on the job, on the set, getting paid something. Everybody was very happy because these people are not making a lot of money doing this either. I mean, that's what's so extraordinary about it. It's this kind of almost effervescent sort of creativity, without necessarily being connected just to a contract and the studio and all this stuff that we expect in Hollywood.
Let me talk about Variety Lights and the way it was received, because as I recall, it's been a few years since I watched the film. It reminds me in certain ways of some of the pre-war Japanese comedies about social life in the 30s. It also has a bit of the sentimentality that Charlie Chaplin had in some of his latest films, and the story itself also reminds me of sort of a comic version of Theo Angelopoulos's later The Traveling Players. Was it well received, or was it considered sappy? What was were the people excited that this was his debut film?
I don't think it got much attention, really. It certainly didn't launch his career.
Not at all. It kind of. There were also actually people making other films at the same time that were in direct later collaborators with Fellini that were actually doing something very similar, and that was kind of, I mean, if Fellini had the attitude that some people had, he'd been very upset about that.
Mm.
Because if you look at some of the other films made at the same time by people that worked with Fellini later, I'm trying to think of the exact title of this film. There actually was one that was very similar to Friday Lights, and all the people in it were basically people that later worked with Fellini. So it's almost as if they set out accidentally to undercut his career. So I don't think he got much out of that. And it certainly didn't help him to work with La Toada because the film didn't do very well. But all those people in it turn up later too. And a lot of the people in that film, a lot of his collaborators are later with him on other films. The White Sheik didn't do very well either, actually.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's to me, it's a masterpiece, but I mean, Woody Allen thinks it's a work of genius. But when it came out, everybody was screaming about how awful using Alberto Sordi was, which is, of course, he's perfect.
Mm.
I mean,
it's sort of the first.
They didn't like using Marlon Brando in The Godfather, and then later on everybody takes credit for it. But nobody wanted anybody in The Godfather to be in The Godfather when Coppola wanted to make the film. Same thing with The White Sheik, actually.
Yeah, I know I've not seen The White Sheik. The only thing I've seen is on the DVD of Knights of Cabiria. That's, I guess, the first. Was Cabiria the character, a minor character in that film?
Yes, she plays a prostitute in that film. Yeah. And it is
having his wife play prostitutes in film, by the way. It's interesting psychological aside.
Now
he did. There are several. I mean, more than just one or two.
Now, I Vitelloni is the film that I think, for me, is the first film that I've seen of Fellini's that's really Fellini as he came to be throughout most of the 50s. I think it's a terrific film. The ending, the camaraderie between these lazy guys. Was that a breakthrough film in terms of critical praise and also, in terms of putting his name on the map? Because that's what it seems like when I've read in the past. Or did they have to wait till La Strada before he became Fellini?
No, I think it was very well received critically. I don't think it was a commercial success.
That's the one that really makes him, a hit. I mean, that's the thing that really makes his reputation, even before La Strada.
Yeah.
La Strada was the international reputation. Vitelloni was the big thing in Italy, and that was crucial because to make other films, he needed money in Italy, not in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, you see that. I mean, the great Fellini, I don't want to say imitator because that's the wrong word, but of course Martin Scorsese uses that opening and
Mean Streets?
Yes, Mean Streets, but also even in Goodfellas.
Yeah.
And I think Diner was influenced. A lot of American films have been influenced by Vitelloni. Boy Story.
Coming of age film. Yeah, it was a coming of age film.
We're not coming of age film.
This is not coming of age. It's much more interesting than coming of age.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's interesting because throughout maybe the next decade or so, his films, with the exception of the two Marcello Mastroianni starring films, are basically all female centered. So, he had this is. What were any of the main players big stars in Italy at the time, or did they become stars out of I Vitelloni?
Franco Fabrizi, was he well known at the time?
Well, not really. And then Moraldo, of course, he became an actor. He was an actor after Vitelloni, the one that plays Moraldo. But he's not. Fellini never really cared too much about famous actors. I mean, he had famous actors in his films, but he didn't really care that much about them in many ways, or used them in ways that are strange.
Yeah, Franco and Interlenghi did do a lot of films, but nothing that really gained him any kind of international reputation.
Yeah.
Of course, he was originally a neorealist non-actor.
Oh, really?
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, in Shoeshine.
Yeah.
So a lot of these guys became actors, but they went into the Italian cinema as non-actors to begin with.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of the neorealism. A lot of the non-actors. I just last night. In fact, rewatched Antonioni's Zabriskie Point, and that's a case where he needed real actors, the two leads. But the next film that I see is he did a segment in one of those films, L'Amour in Chita. I guess that's another one of those sort of extravaganza films where there's a number of segments. You said this was popular in Italian culture. Was television big in Italy in 1950s, or had it not come? Was that perhaps one of the reasons you had a lot of these films that had segments, because Italian television had not yet established itself?
Virtually non-existent, except at a bar, somewhere in a neighborhood or something at that point. I mean, you still have, the big thing is still soccer and still cinema and still vaudeville, really, through the 50s and places like Naples, even through the 60s.
And
So
I would
it's not.
think vaudeville structure was one of the things that led to having 5 or 6 different segments in a film. I'm not sure, but I think that's possible.
Yeah, no, it's like like a circus act. Here, we'll bring out the elephants. Okay, here's the magician. Here's and if you see this in the films too, because they're sort of imitating the structure of the vaudeville and the circus, even or the carnival, if you will. So yeah, but it was really pretty much non-existent until really the 60s.
Mm.
When you get to the 60s, you get that mass media, and you get the paparazzi and Fellini and the Dolce Vita and all that. You start to get the real mass media is the television more than anything else.
Yeah.
So no, that's why people went to the movies like crazy. They didn't have television.
Now, you mentioned La Strada being the big international breakthrough, and I guess this is also the film that made his wife a big star, Giulietta Messina. And it also is interesting is that it stars Anthony Quinn and Richard Basehart, two actors from America. And I guess at this time, were European films trying to get American actors to get that more global reach to reach into the American markets?
I think the phenomenon here was quite specific to Italy, because there was a period which was called Hollywood on the Tiber, where American actors, as the American industry was in crisis, American actors and productions went over to Italy because American actors were looking for work, and production costs were much lower in Italy. So you start with Quo Vadis in, I think, 1948, and from there you develop sort of what develops then into the American spectacular sword and sandal film, Ben-Hur, etc. So many of these films were shot at Cinecittà. So I think this was a highly Italian kind of phenomenon, where all sorts of Americans went over and worked within Italy. Of course, Clint Eastwood is another example, then the spaghetti western, etc. So I don't think it was a European phenomenon so much as an Italian phenomenon.
But at the same
What's interesting?
I was just going to say, at the same time, the mid 50s was when sort of foreign films became bigger in the U.S., because you had Bergman with like Summer with Monica, you had Kurosawa and the Seven Samurai, Rashomon. They all hit sort of in the mid 50s, along with La Strada.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Frank mentioned the peplum, these sand and sandal epics. Well, of course, that was all based on foreign and very often American bodybuilders too.
Mm.
Even it was not only just actors, but even bodybuilders. They're flexing their muscles, Steve Reeves type guys.
Yeah.
So this was a big deal, and it was smart because once they did if they did get exported, and they didn't often always get exported, but once they did, pretty much people did recognize not so much Richard Basehart, but certainly Anthony Quinn, or you'd see a recognizable face, and that would be a kind of a guarantee that, well, I've seen that guy, he was pretty interesting, I think I'll go to that movie. And that was a very smart move on the Italians' part. And Fellini was always very clever about that too. He had an eye to the market. He wasn't just an art for art's sake kind of guy. He wanted people to see his films.
And the other films that was sort of the European art film movement that you're talking about, Dan. I think it came out of a number of different things. One was the sort of post-war, was sort of the Marshall Plan mentality, where the U.S. was very, very interested in promoting itself to other countries, and obviously for that reason also doing something reciprocal in terms of bringing other films to North America. And there was also this tremendous sort of global curiosity with the emergence of air travel, etc. So I think there was I think there were sort of cultural influences that gave rise to the European art film. But the other thing is that Hollywood, in this period of suffering, also tried to capture a new market. So it sort of imported the art film as a way of capturing a market that it was felt it was losing to television. So I think there are a lot of reasons why it was more dispersed than just in Italy, but also Italy was a particular sort of Marshall Plan particularity to it as well.
Yeah, I did a show last year on film noir in the U.S. in the 50s, and I was wondering if one of the popular reasons for sort of the emergence of foreign films might have been that Hollywood, mainstream Hollywood, A-film Hollywood, was doing a lot of the big musicals. They were doing a lot of the Eisenhower sort of looking at the sunny side of things. Only film noir really looked at working class people, but they were always sort of degenerates. They were gangsters and whatnot. Yet if you look at a Lestrada, or you look at Bergman's films, these are people that, yeah, you may have some intellectuals in Bergman's films, but these are people that you can relate to. I'm wondering if sort of Hollywood got out of touch in the 50s, and some of these European films filled a void.
Yeah, that's certainly my sense that that there was. I mean, I think this happens in Germany and Italy and the U.S. as well. And following the Second World War, there's not a great desire within a particular culture to face the pain that they've just gone through. But the Italians did do it. The Italians did do it in terms of neorealism, and Bergman's films of the mid to late 40s are extremely realistic as well.
Yeah.
So I think that on the one hand there was a kind of evasion of the recent past going on, and on the other hand there was a thirst to understand it, and very often that thirst got quenched by looking at films in which other cultures were looking at their recent experiences. So I think you're right. I think it was the flip side, that there were audiences that wanted to look back at the Second World War, and that Hollywood wasn't producing that kind of film other than best years of our lives. There were some films that did it, but not a whole lot.
The one film that's very interesting is Edward Dmytryk's Christ in Concrete, which was based on a Hollywood film about the most famous Italian-American novel about Italian-American immigrants. And that film is actually indebted to Italian neorealism. I mean, literally Italian neorealism. And if you look into Edward Dmytryk's life, of course, he's one of the Hollywood connected with all the McCarthyism in Hollywood, and he was definitely a guy that was looking for that kind of film, and actually made at least one of his own that was influenced by a neorealist film. So there were some. There were some things going in the other direction, but not that much, obviously. I mean, there were more musicals than Christ in Concrete, with Italian laborers buried in wet cement because of shoddy working conditions on the workplace. That wasn't the cutting edge of the 50s in many cases. That kind of a film, but there are some that go the other direction.
Yeah, I mentioned film noir, and I just see that the next film after Lestrada is called Il Bidone, or The Swindle. Was this an attempt to do sort of a noirish thing? Because it seems to, from what I'm reading in the description, involve a bunch of crooks and criminals and swindlers and whatnot. Or was this a comedy?
I think it wasn't noir in style at all. But the whole sort of emphasis on the underworld links up to film noir. It wasn't a comedy either. It was very harsh. In some ways, it's Fellini's harshest film, except maybe for orchestra rehearsal. I don't know, Peter. What's your sensibility?
Well, I mean, it is about the sort of it does play with the Christian idea of the thief on the side of Christ, as he's being crucified. It's this idea that there's such a thing as a good thief, except at the end of the film, he's not good. I mean, and that's the difference between a Fellini film about a good thief and somebody else's. He turns out to actually done the worst thing possible, to steal from people who are, destitute and crippled, and these horrible things he does. But he still searches. He searches for redemption. That's the Christian part, but he doesn't. You don't know if he really finds. I mean, it's a question whether he finds it or not in the film.
Well,
But
the
it's
film
pretty
so
sweet, dude.
yeah.
Pardon?
It's so Catholic. It's all about death and rebirth, right? I mean, digging things up, and it's just almost a parody of certain kind of Catholic rituals and beliefs. Yeah.
It's the least understood of his, I think, in many ways, the least popular of his films, too. Yeah. Even though it had Frederick Crawford, who I remember from Highway Patrol as a kid, that awful TV program that was, I had to watch it now more than 30 minutes, I'd probably shoot myself. But, he was a recognizable American actor. That was one of the points. So Fellini, I thought that would help the film. I don't think it did very well.
No, that was a disaster.
Right, but between the other two that did phenomenally well, and then La Dolce Vita, I think Fellini, could afford a few misfires. I don't think it's a bad film at all.
No, not at all. I think it's a really, really interesting film. I agree.
Well, let me ask you, since it deals with crooks and criminals, I can't. I've watched a number of Italian directors, and they've dealt with fascism. They've dealt with the Roman Catholic Church, and even undertones of pedophilia going back to the stuff in the 50s. Was there any Italian filmmakers that dealt with the criminal underworld, the Sicilian mafia or the Camorra or anything, or was this something that was just verboten, that you could talk about crooks and individual crooks, but or even crooked government officials, but you couldn't ever really do a film, say, on the mafia or whatnot? And did Fellini ever want to do so, but was dissuaded? I'm just throwing that out there because I know in the U.S. when we did film noir, it was always called the Syndicate. You didn't have, and it was not as many Italian names.
Well, Pietro Germi was interested in the underworld, and starting in the late 40s, El Maledetto Imbroglio was a fantastic film. That's also based on an Italian novel. So Pietro Germi was, and he also dealt with sort of Sicilian mafia mentality in his comedies of the 1960s. So there were some directors dealing with it, but not all that directly, except that I would say that Francesco Rossi was the figure who first really took on issues of the South and criminality in the South. And his work, I think, was probably starts in the early 1960s. But at the time Fellini's career was developing, no, I don't think there was a lot of attention to the mafia, to the underworld.
There's a lot, but now it's become a real sort of, frankly, a subcategory in Italian cinema. I mean, you get a book on Italian cinema now. You need a chapter on the mafia film or the crime film or the terrorist film or all these things that in 1950 there were. Jeremy was the one. If you had to pick somebody, you were absolutely right. That's the guy who really did something on the mafia. But now it's just like every time you turn around, there's a new film on the mafia. So that there's certainly no reticence about it now. Just the opposite. I mean, look at the people that have made their whole career, like Garone and people like that, on new directors that really do it with a vengeance.
Yeah, but I think Tony was more about petty urban criminality, and it had nothing to do with organized crime. It's a very different kind of context.
Yeah. Let me end this first segment talking about Nights of Cabiria. And again, I didn't see a couple of the films that have been mentioned, but of all the films that I've seen from Variety Lights through Nights of Cabiria, by the time he gets to Nights of Cabiria, it seems that Fellini is at the height of his powers. I mean, that's a film that's just, I think, a great film. I think it's better than La Strada. I think Messina is at her absolute peak as an actress. That she can play comedy, she can play tragedy, she can play drama, melodrama. Was this another highlight? Was this a film that, like La Strada before it, just took sort of the art film world by storm across the world?
Well, La Strada ran for 3 years in New York City. I don't think Cabiria had anything like that kind of success, but it did win an Oscar like La Strada. But I think it sort of built on La Strada rather than being seen as sort of an equivalent and independent artwork. I don't know. What was your sense, Peter?
Well, I actually think it's probably more popular in France than the United States, because I mean, the minute Bazin wrote an essay on something, it became important. And I think that was one of the things about the film, there's a difference in the reception. I think La Strada, I mean, Walt Disney wanted to make La Strada, redo it with a character, because it's a cartoon character after all. She's based on Happy Hooligan, Fortunello in Italian. So I think that's the interesting thing about it is that it seems that had more traction in Europe than La Strada did in the United States. But I think the whole thing was, I mean, it's pretty unusual for a guy to, win an Oscar, misfire, and come back and win another Oscar. That's a pretty big deal. And I think by that time, Fellini's career was really launched like a rocket ship. Everybody knew him. Everybody wanted him to work in America. He didn't do it, but he really had. By that time, he was an international star. And
well,
so
happy to hear that you liked the film. I love the film, and the first time I saw it, it was introduced by somebody who said it had the 7 most beautiful minutes in the history of cinema, which is the final scene.
Yeah.
And I felt that way as well. But I find it's a difficult film now to share, in a sense, in terms of with students, etc., because it does seem to have a kind of sentimentality and kind of a religiosity to it that's so out of touch with the world we live in. So I'm really happy to find somebody who shares my love for that film.
Well, I think that the ending of Cabiria is head and shoulders above La Strada. The La Strada ending with Zampano on the beach seems to me a bit of a force. It doesn't ring as true as Cabiria. Cabiria, for those who don't know, she's been swindled. She thinks she's going to be tossed off a cliff by her latest boyfriend in a string of boyfriends. And then she walks back and sort of these people who are picnicking or partying or whatnot. And she's surrounded by them. And it's almost like, and she's crying her eyes out and whatnot. It seems that she's probably going to still do stupid things, but it seems more naturalistic than the ending of La Strada. And I think I think Messina gives a much better performance. Not that she was bad in La Strada, but I think that's sort of a performance for the ages there. And let me just ask about Messina, since we're talking about Fellini. I've only seen her, because I have limited resources, I've only seen her in the Fellini films. Where was her career before Fellini? And did she make any significant films outside of the work with her husband?
Well, it's hard to really compare that she's in a lot of films. Okay, she was actually in a lot of Pirandello plays in the 30s and 40s. Wow. People like to think that Fellini doesn't like Pirandello. His wife was in Pirandello films right and left, and according to me at least, he has a very big influence on Fellini's own ideas about the film character. But the truth is that nothing she ever did ever had that impact.
Yeah.
Although people knew her in Italy more than they knew Fellini.
Yeah.
Because she was in a lot of television things too.
And radio, right?
Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah. She was very famous, even before the war, as this character on these radio programs. So she has kind of a strange sort of career. And I think in some ways it may very well be true that Fellini sort of hogged her as an actress. That he didn't really, I don't think he felt very good about sharing her with other directors. I don't know what the reason was, and I think she felt some irritation at times because of that. She never did anything better than with Fellini, that's for sure.
Well, let's end it right there and in this segment. In our next segment, we'll start up on the second half of Fellini's career, starting with La Dolce Vita, and we'll do that when we return in a moment. I'm back talking with Peter Bondinello and Frank Burke about the life and career of Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini. In the end of the last segment there, Frank, you had mentioned that, or you implied sort of that Nights of Cabiria doesn't have sort of, I guess, the fondness in people's memories as some of the earlier Fellini films. And I want to pick up on that because when I look back at the critical reception for the next 2 films, or the next 2 major films, La Dolce Vita and 8½, there was a small segment of a film, Boccaccio 70, in between. Those 2 seem to have gotten very different critical receptions. 8½, is often lauded as his total masterpiece, but I think just the opposite. To me, I think I think Fellini was never better than in La Dolce Vita. I think it's not only his best film. I'm not big on top 10 films or whatnot, but when I think of a film that does just about everything right, it's a great drama, it's a great comedy, it has a great musical sequence. Mastroianni is brilliant in it. The symbolism is brilliant in it. The thing that's often criticized the most about La Dolce Vita is it doesn't have a plot, which is stupid as hell. It's got definitive segments that plug in and feed off of one another. The acting by Anouk Aimée in several of her scenes. The other girlfriend, whose name slips my mind at the moment, is terrific. Even Anita Ekberg playing sort of the bubble-headed blonde, out of her league intellectually. She's perfect. There was the scenes with the children, and the fake Mary sighting. At the end, the final so-called orgy, although it's not really an orgy. The sea monster, the little girl at the end. I mean, to me, this is Fellini at his best. And if I were to pick in terms of cinematography, screenplay, acting, and anything else you can think of, even the music, Rhoda's music is perfect in there. I mean, to me, this is easily a top 10 film of all time, and it would probably be my pick for the greatest overall film that I've ever seen. And yet, it always seems to be slagged upon. And it had great cultural, you mentioned paparazzi, from the character paparazzi. It's had a great cultural impact. Uh, Let me ask both of you, what is your personal assessment of the film, and what do you think about the cultural baggage, pro or con, and the critical baggage that has come with it? Either one of you want to go?
Well, I mean, I think there are two. I think people divide into two camps. Those who like Fellini, for one thing, people divide into two camps: those who like him, those who hate him. But for those who like him, I think it's pretty equally divided. Some people really like La Dolce Vita. Some people really like Eight and a Half. So I don't. I guess filmmakers really like Eight and a Half because it's so experimental in terms of what it does with the medium. So I think it gets greater recognition from filmmakers, but from the general sort of Fellini populace, I would say they're fairly equally divided. I really like everything you said about La Dolce Vita. I think one of the problems with Fellini is every time he perfected something, and I think he did it with Nights of Cabiria. He perfected La Strada. With La Dolce Vita, he made a perfect film, but that was boring to him. So then he had to go on and do something entirely different. And if you look at the films from La Dolce Vita to Satyricon, every film, with the possible exception of Juliet of the Spirits, is an experimental departure from what he did before.
Yeah.
And he evidences a kind of experimentation that I think is unique in the history of film. I don't know of any feature-length filmmaker who ever changed his style so dramatically from film to film over an 8, 10, 12-year period the way Fellini did. So the perfection of La Dolce Vita.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think if you look at something like Satyricon, you go back and look at La Dolce Vita, it's like two different people. I mean, if you think about it, it's like, you look at 20 Turner paintings, and you see Turner. You look at Satyricon and La Dolce Vita, and you see two different people, actually. Yeah. I think, at least. And that's really extraordinary. He doesn't get the credit he deserves for that, actually. No. Because you just expect that. You come to, it's Fellini. He's doing something.
Yeah, that's right. Another weird film, but they're all
weird film by Fellini. Well, guess what? It's not that easy to do. Go try it and see how you do.
Well, I think La Dolce Vita was before he sort of went overboard on sort of what later became called his grotesques. There's the passage where Marcello's father comes to visit him, that you get a real undertone of what probably went on in this family, even though it's only hinted at in a few sort of passages between the father. They go out for a night on the town. Or whatnot, but you get a real sense, even the way the body movements of Marcello Mastroianni, which I don't know if Mastroianni's ever gotten the total credit for being such a great actor, but in that film especially, I mean, you look at the way he shrugs, the way he looks at his father longingly. I can't say enough about Mastroianni. It's just, to me, a masterclass in acting.
No, I agree with everything you say. The scene of the balloons in Polydor.
Yeah.
That is to me the most moving scene in the history of Fellini and all of Fellini's work. I live with that, still. So
it goes all the way back to the silent cinema. That guy is the silent cinema. So pays homage to the little films he saw when he was a kid when he does that. Because Polydor is literally not even the fascist period; it's even further back.
Sure.
It's amazing that he's still alive. Actually, he does.
Now, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
Well, for me, one of the fascinating things about Fellini is the way he changes with the times. I mean, up through La Dolce Vita, he's making films that are still relatively social realist, even though, the Marxists in Italy weren't happy with La Strada. But in the 1960s, he starts making head films. I mean, everything with 8½, and Juliet of the Spirits, and Toby Dammit, everybody sort of living in their heads. And I mean, it was head tripping, and that's exactly what the period was. It's partly why Fellini's reputation was so great, I think, in North America, that he was seen to represent really this breakout period of kind of hallucinatory joy that a certain part of the 1960s represented. So for me, historically, the films from 8½, through Satyricon and Roma they are my favorite films because he broke away from the realism. But this is exactly it. There's sort of half the world that really privileges the social realist Fellini, and La Dolce Vita is the culmination of that, with all sorts of imaginative sort of components to it as well. Whereas the kind of head trippy Fellini, which I prefer, is some people prefer that, but most people don't. So,
well, let me ask.
The interesting thing about La Dolce Vita, however, is this idea that he's reflecting the paparazzi, and he's reflecting this kind of media consciousness. Actually, he was ahead of that. It was a very small sliver of Italian society. These guys that were running around the Via Veneto taking pictures of Clark Gable and those people. The truth is that Italy was not in the society that you see in years later when he does the film about Berlusconi and television. I mean, the real media society is later. He really anticipates sort of the world that's all public relations, because Italy is not public relations in 1959. It's just not like it's he invents it really. And he invents it in a way. He invents it in a wonderful way. Because one of the things I have in the book I did on Fellini was the picture of the Dolce, the Via Veneto. So of course, it's in a studio. It's totally flat. So I mean, it's all contrived. It's a fake Via Veneto. It's not reflection of reality at all. He made it up. Now, it also is true that Anita Ekberg, the real Anita Ekberg, really did jump into the fountain, the Trevi fountain, and nearly froze her rear end off. And there really is somebody who really did a striptease. But Fellini made that more real than the reality of the paparazzi. And that's what's so interesting about Fellini. He anticipates this sort of stuff. Somewhere he says, and I can never find the quotation again, somewhere he says you don't have to read Ulysses, James Joyce or Ulysses, to understand its impact. You can see it in advertising. Yeah. So something like this. Really he's right. An artist anticipates things. He doesn't just sit back and reflect them. And that's the thing I love about Fellini, that he makes up stuff.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be more real than reality.
Before we move on to the head trippy Fellini, I just want to ask two more questions about La Dolce Vita. The first is there's the whole passage with the intellectual Steiner, and I've read that that was based on perhaps a handful of people. No one's ever really known who it was. Someone said it was a friend of Fellini's. So number one, was that based upon a friend? And the second one is about the film's supposed censorship by the Roman Catholic Church. To what degree did that affect the film's reputation and box office? So first maybe Steiner, and then talk about the film's reputation and perhaps banned in Boston kind of reputation.
It's possible that it could have been based on Cesare Pavese to commit suicide. He was trying to be intellectual. I don't know if that was the case. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure that Fellini needed somebody to commit suicide in order to put it in a film. But definitely he really stepped into it with this, because people would spit on him in public. The Catholic Church was just up in arms, and actually he was very courageous, I think, to make a film like that. And it was, of course, the biggest box office hit. Of course, naturally, when you get controversy, people go see it. It was also the biggest box office hit in Europe for years and years and years. It's been surpassed by now, but I mean, for 20 or 30 years, practically, it was the top box office hit of a European film in Europe.
And yeah, so I think the Catholic Church's reaction was actually the best advertising that the film could have had. But that too was also divided because the Jesuits all came out, not all came out, but Fellini had a very close friend who was a Jesuit, and he had a lot of support from the Jesuits in terms of the film. So the church itself was divided. I think L'Osservatore Romano hated it, but there were a lot of Catholic intellectuals and actually clerical intellectuals who supported it. But I think that the church's opposition to it right at that moment, if you think of 1960 and the increasing secularization of society, not only in Italy but throughout the world, that I think that actually did a whole lot to boost it. And there was always this sense that European films were really sexy, and because of the Hollywood code, etc. There is not a single. One of the things that's very funny to me is that the closest you ever get to a sex scene in all of Fellini is a scene where Marcello and Anuka Me go off in the prostitute's car, and we get some vague hint that they made love. There is no sex in Fellini. There's absurdly grotesque, sort of repressed and projected sexuality, but there's absolutely no sex. However, the illusion at the time, the assumption at the time in North America was that these European films were really sexy, so you had to go out and see them in order to see them flesh. So.
Well, there was that absurd scene later in Amicode where the Tita almost gets snuffed out by the giant woman with big breasts, but
right.
Now
Sure.
go ahead.
Actually, I'm not sure what that is actually.
Yeah. Now, before 8½, he did another segment of one of those sort of all-star films, Boccaccio 70. Was there anything worth remarking there? Because this made him have 7½ films, basically.
I think it's a brilliant film.
Yeah, if you've ever seen that in 35mm restored, it's a smashing film. It's just unbelievably good. But the thing is, it's all about, among other things, it's all about the whole image of sexuality in La Dolce Vita. Fellini sort of gets his revenge on the critics.
Yes, and it's about advertising again. And the other thing, really where the head trip takes off, because the main character basically goes crazy. And that leads into 8½, and Juliet of the Spirits, and all the films about characters who are living to a large extent within their imagination. So The Temptation, it was also his first color film. So it's absolutely crucial in Fellini's development for a lot of reasons.
Oh, that was color. Okay. Well, let me ask then about 8½. Now, its title obviously comes from what I had just said. He had 6 full-length feature films, the half film with L'Etoile, and the 2 segments in other films. So, was there a working title to that film, or was it just one of those things he didn't know what to do and just that came out?
La Bella Confusione, The Great Confusion, was, I think, the working title for it.
They say, who knows? I mean, it's not clear whether somebody has in fact located. I didn't get my mitts on the last copy of the screenplay with all the other things I got that I brought back to university, unfortunately, because nobody really knew where the last copy was. Now, there may be somebody right now that's doing an edition of what he thinks is the last copy, but that's very confusing because, even with La Strada, there's just you think you'd have the last copy when you got it right from the Pinelli, who had it in his little file cabinet, but actually it turns out that in many cases there was one at a government office, there's one with a script writer, somebody was loaned something. So who knows what the last script of 8½, is? And who knows really whether the script was really the thing that was dominating most of the film. It's a real mystery, actually. Because in my personal opinion, this is the great point. This is the one I like. This is it.
Yeah.
When you make a film like this, it's like making The Godfather. You can just shut up shop. You can quit. You can't beat a film like 8½. And I know that people think it's vapid and all that. It's not at all. It's just but I think it's the most brilliant film that Fellini ever made, by far.
Yeah. The 8½ too also refers to the age of the child. I think that's really important. The child figure is 8½, and also Eight is, I mean, this is the way Fellini's mind works, which is not rational or conceptual, but the eight is a symbol of infinity and a half is a finite fraction. So he's combining the finite and the infinite. So eight and a half has more meanings than just being his eight and a half film. But he was always very modest and he hated people to interpret anything. So he always reduced the meanings of what he did to the bare minimum so nobody would view him as an intellectual, which is something that he really hated, and which is why, in effect, Steiner kills himself in Little Adultery.
Intellectuals don't have. I mean, by definition, Steiner doesn't have imagination.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, if he had imagination, he wouldn't kill himself.
Yeah, very.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the point. You know, that he has intellect, but that's not enough.
And he has fear. He has such incredible fear because of his intellect is just envisioning these paranoid realities around him. So, yeah.
The next film, Juliet of the Spirits, I think is a really underrated film, because I always look at it as sort of Fellini does A Doll's House in a sense. You know, it's about sort of the maturation of this sort of hausfrau, and yet when I read a lot of the criticism, I guess because of the two prior main films, La Dolce Vita and Eight and a Half, it tends to get sort of lost in between them and the far more experimental films of the late 60s through the early 70s. Do you have a sense too that critically this is a film that has been sort of under-regarded or overlooked because of what came before and then what came after?
I do. I'm totally with you again, as with Nights of Cabiria. I love Juliet of the Spirits, and I think it's always lumped into, oh, it's a female version of Eight and a Half. It's a very, very different film.
Yeah.
His use of color, his use of the camera, the opening sequence of the film when she's looking in the mirror and you cannot see, there's absolutely no point from which the perspective of the film can be determined. It's absolutely brilliant. If you look at it, he just evaporates materiality through the way he uses the camera in that opening sequence. And throughout the film, I think it's absolutely, again, a very experimental film, but it got seen as, oh, another Jungian film, which I don't see at all. The other thing that I think is really ignored about it, it's an incredible satire. It's like Buñuel. The dialogue in that film is hilarious. It's such a critique of the bourgeoisie. That's another dimension that I think gets very lost, which Eight and a Half isn't. So I find it a very, very different film from Eight and a Half. I love it. I think it's quite extraordinary.
Peter, do you have any comments on Juliet of the Spirits?
No, I agree with that. I think it is really not, although it certainly has something to do with Jung, it isn't just another version of Eight and a Half, you know, the female version. Also, some feminist critics have tended not to be very kind to Fellini, I think, very often because they miss the point of the satire. But certainly, and if you take the year it was made and the way that Fellini tries to establish some sort of an actual, you know, female character who's a real person instead of some sort of symbol or some sex symbol, you know, it seems to me that it's a rather courageous film, actually. I mean, he's also putting his wife into it, which of course is already very scary territory because, I mean, remember Fellini was guilty of a lot of things, all of which were very nice to his wife, and therefore, you know, he's also talking about himself in many ways when he talks about the husbands in his films. I mean, there are people who think that La Strada is really about Fellini's own self-portrait of a husband, monster kind of Zampano. So, I mean, I think that's very important to remember. Fellini's not somebody who just, you know, is interested in women as a sex symbol. I think he's also interested in their emotional and spiritual life as well, which is something that doesn't get much credit for.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think one of the things, too, that, I mean, this was a period when there was not obviously a strong body of work by women filmmakers, but the people who were making films about women were the European art film. You know, Bergman was making films about women. Fellini's Satyajit Ray. You're not European, but Asian. But at any rate, there was this attempt in the '60s, along with sort of sexual liberation, to try to understand a woman's perspective. And I think one of the signs of Fellini's humility, which I think is not really recognized at all, is that in the '60s and '50s, people believed that sort of there was a universal liberation going on, and gender was not all that important. You could talk about women or men sort of in the same way. With the feminist movement in the 1970s, Fellini left that behind completely. He did not try to represent women's experience anymore. He just tried to represent the idiocies of masculinity in Fellini's Casanova and City of Women, etc. So he shifted over completely, as I think a lot of male filmmakers did. They recognized as a result of the feminist movement that you couldn't really take the position of a woman with great ease or without enormous complications as a male director, that it was more honest to talk about masculinity. So I think, as Peter says, for the 1960s, Juliet of the Spirits was an incredibly courageous thing to do. For the 1970s, it was more important that Fellini focus on his own masculinity through films like Casanova and City of Women.
Earlier we mentioned Antonioni, and I did a show last year on Antonioni's career. Fellini and Antonioni have often been compared to sort of the yin and yang of Italian cinema. What? Just give me before we move on, your perspectives on these two sort of, at the time in the mid '60s when Juliet of the Spirits came out. These were probably the two guys, even more so than Rossellini or Visconti or anything. Where do you think their two visions of film stood? Were they contrapuntal to one another? Were there things that critics at the time missed? Because it seems to me that both of them were looking deep at the human experience, but in radically different ways. Fellini seemed to be more of sort of the id, or the ego going into the center of the characters and then bringing them out, whereas Antonioni was getting more sort of increasingly remote and looking almost with a scientist's eye at the human condition. Do either of you have any opinions on these two, the way they differed in their filmmaking?
Well, that's a tough question. I do think that if you sort of have to take some examples. I mean, like for instance, the big film that Antonioni made in that period, in terms of commercial success, was Blow Up.
Yeah.
But the early trilogy of Solitude, if you want to call it that, the La Ventura, La Notte l'Eclisse, is quite a different kind of a film. So, I mean, in many ways, Antonioni did something like Fellini. He was jumping around from one sort of film to all of a sudden something that was almost being edited like commercials and color instead of black and white, and still the feminist protagonist that Antonioni always used. I mean, there's one thing you can say about Antonioni: he really focuses on women in his films, at least on these films. So I don't know that I'm not sure there's any real reason to say to compare and contrast them. Italy was just lucky to have so many good directors at the same time. But you could also add Pasolini and Visconti to the mixture, and you get and then the young Bertolucci, and you start getting all sorts of things percolating together. I personally, I'm partial, I guess so is Frank, to Fellini rather than Antonioni, but I admire Antonioni. I don't necessarily enjoy him as much as I do Fellini, but that's like red wine or white wine.
Well, if I had a second life, I would spend that on Antonioni. I think I like him as much as Fellini, but I've never been able to spend that much time on him. I think, Peter, what you're saying, Eclipse and Juliet of the Spirits are both films about women's sort of emancipation in one way or another. And I think Fellini saw it at a certain point in his career as occurring through the imagination and through psychological development. I think Antonioni instead was trying to strip or trying to radically change the way in which we perceive the world. And basically, I see his work as being very similar to the French New Novel at the same time, which is instead of psychologically possessing the world, which is what Fellini's been accused of doing. I don't think it's what he does do. I think Antonioni's involved in kind of stripping away normal perceptual responses to what we see so that we're totally open to a new kind of consciousness. So I think both of them were really concerned about a transformation of consciousness. But Fellini did it sort of under the sign of plenitude, and Antonioni did it under the sign of sort of stripping away and radically altering and breaking down normal sort of psychic connections between things. So I think that has a lot to do with the way in which their styles differ. But I think they were part of the same enterprise, and as Peter says, an extraordinarily exciting moment.
Yeah, I mean, you look back on it, you just wonder, how did anybody have so many interesting people to talk about?
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I mean, remember, we're also talking about the same era with the spaghetti western, which is, I mean, Sergio Leone, in my opinion, was a genius.
Totally.
So every time you turn around, you bump into something else that's extraordinary. It was really the most, revolutionary period in Italian culture. It was cinema. It wasn't literature by any stretch of the imagination. After Pirandello, it wasn't. It was cinema, and that was this incredible performance of a culture that was producing these giant figures, one after another, and they kept. And actually, it's not doing so badly still, strangely enough.
Now, after Juliet of the Spirit comes, I guess, the most polarizing portion of Fellini's career. Maybe not polarizing. I guess most people sort of look away from some of these films. I mean, I've seen Roma and I've seen Satyricon. I haven't seen The Clowns. I've seen The Director's Notebook, and I haven't seen the Toby Dammit section. But it seems that Fellini was sort of combining documentary style, from what I can read there, with some of the more fantastical things. I think Satyricon is actually a very interesting film, but from what I read critically, most critics there think it's just sort of like a gooey mishmash in between Juliet and Amarcord, which was, I guess, a lot of people thought of as his comeback film critically or whatnot. Talk about some of these films, which one Toby Dammit was a portion of one of these sort of all-star films. What is your sense about Fellini in that sort of 5-film run there?
Well, I don't agree with that at all. I don't know who you're reading. I don't know of anybody that said that Satyricon was a mishmash. It seems to me it's one of the most extraordinary assemblage of fascinating images that you can find in film. I think it's doing. I mean, and it's also one of the big counterculture films of historical, dimensions. People were in Yankee Stadium. Everybody was smoking a joint, watching Fellini's Satyricon. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment in counterculture events. And the new version, when you get the new Criterion version, it's just knocks your socks off, I think. But I may be guilty of liking anything Fellini does. I don't think I actually am, but I mean, I would, if you pick something I would pick on, I wouldn't pick on Satyricon. Put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think let's start with Toby Dammit in a way, and it goes back to something I was saying earlier, which is that Fellini, as soon as he did something, he didn't want to do it again, and so Toby Dammit was a film about suicide, in effect, and it was a film in which Fellini talked about throwing himself into the sea and taking all the mannerisms that he had become used to employing in his films and just jettisoning them, just basically canceling them out. So Toby Dammit to me is this kind of and Fellini used the same term about the kind of the insanity of the world of Satyricon, that there was or really about the 60s as a moment in which Western civilization was trying to perform a kind of gentle suicide to become something new after the failures of the first 2,000 years. So I think that Fellini had this tremendous sort of 1960s sense of the possibility of the end of something and the beginning of something new, and that the same thing was going on in terms of his filmmaking style. So I think that after Juliet of the Spirits, he makes a film in Toby Dammit that's both psychological and the destruction of psychology. And then in Satyricon, he does something similar to what I was saying about Antonioni before. He tries to strip away all conventional ways of interpreting a film. He just gives us images and scenes, and he he basically bases it on somebody else so that it's not his story. And he tries to create a radical kind of distance between his past as a filmmaker and that film and the audience in that film as well. So that I think he's trying to accomplish something radically different. I don't think, I think what we're talking about too is a couple of other things here, which is that for mainstream film goers, this is kind of scary stuff. It's not something that they particularly want to engage with. But also for a Hollywood in crisis, which is now withdrawing money from the European market and making it more and more difficult for Italians to make films, that it becomes extremely risky, and it does become a kind of commercial suicide to be trying to make experimental feature-length films. And I think the reaction to Fellini is partly the negative reaction to Fellini is partly a result of this sense that he was not making films that could attract an audience and actually could guarantee his future as a filmmaker. And this actually pretty much turns out to be true. And so I think that there were expectations. There would still be the hooks, the psychological hooks, the sort of hooks of the 1960s. And with Satyricon, I think he just ruptures that. He does come back and make Amarcord, which is a totally film. But that's really the end of it. After that, Fellini's films are not palatable to any kind of sort of feature-length film-going audience.
The Clowns. I've not seen that one, but it's worth mentioning that throughout Fellini, he has this obsession with sort of the clown-like figures. You mentioned the La Dolce Vita balloon scene, La Strada. I think in Variety Lights there's a scene there too. And having seen some documentaries on Fellini, he was greatly influenced, I guess, as a child by the circus and by seeing clowns. What is the import of clowns in his work, both psychologically and do they represent sort of an innocent figure? Because oftentimes here in America, clowns are now seen as sinister, as post Stephen King. What did clowns represent in Fellini's work?
There are different kinds of clowns. There's the white authoritarian clown that is always, it's Laurel and Hardy. I mean, if you take any comedy team, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, you'll get one that's the authoritarian guy that gives the orders, and the other one that's the crazy irrational type. So Gelsomina would be your irrational sort of likable clown, and then the white clown or the French clowns in the film are the ones that are authoritarians. But I think Fellini just sees that as kind of different continuums of human types or behaviors. I mean, I don't think it's like a commedia dell'arte style character. And he always bases his characters on something like that. I mean, he's not, there's no Othellos or Hamlets in Fellini. That's not the kind of characters he has. He has often cartoon characters, which are one of the reasons I like him, actually. No Hamlets, who am I? Give me a break. We don't need to talk about, to be or not to be. That's a different kind of a work in Fellini. He's interested in other things. So I mean, I think those are simply they're like on a continuum. You can get different kinds of clowns, and everybody sort of falls. Human types can fall in this continuum. Same thing with the commedia dell'arte types. Very often, his characters are those kinds of types too.
Peter, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned it, but what do you think the relationship was between his cartoon career and the clown? Because it strikes me that the clown is not so much conceptual as a visual reality for Fellini, and ties in with the kind of drawings that he did. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the thing is, Fellini always used drawings. Instead of saying do X, on a set, he would give somebody a drawing and say, make it look like this. So it would be the chin of Casanova. You've seen all those drawings, Casanova, where he takes the chin off. I can't even remember his name now.
Donald Sutherland?
Donald, of course. So I mean, instead of saying make it look like this, he gives, he does a quick drawing. He could do a drawing in 2 seconds. So I mean, he would use these sort of magic markers with real stark cartoon-like colors. Actually, it's one of the things about Satyricon I like so much. It's been compared to the colors in Flash Gordon, for instance. But there's a real stark block-like, also early frescoes are like that, two big blocks of color and big splotches, because given the way you make fresco, you can't be, little details. You have to be big splotches of color. That's the way he did Satyricon, I think, with the color. And so, I mean, I think that every moment he worked, he was using cartoons and caricatures, and you almost never see a character that's not the picture of it is almost always a caricature. It's not a picture. It's just not a realistic picture of Casanova. It's a caricature of what Casanova is. And then he gives this to the set director, and you can see this in the scripts we have at Indiana, at the Lilly Library. You can actually go look at the script, and he'll say, make it look like this, or make 500 yards of autostrada for Roma. We don't need any more than 500 feet or 500 yards. And it's as if he's. I don't know. It's like a writer would dictate something into a recorder. That's his working method. And he's always writing cards. He's always drawing color cartoons, and they're always caricatures. They're never realistic. And that's it.
Now,
so yeah, I think it's just the way he works. It's like have pencil and paper.
Amarcord is the film in '73. And that's sort of a bit toned down from some of the experimental stuff that he had done just prior to that, and it's set in his, I think, hometown of Rimini, and it's set during the fascist era of, I guess, the late 20s to the 30s, right before the war. It's one of those films that has a lot of these sequences. I mean, my favorite sequence is when the crazy uncle climbs up in the tree and starts screaming that he needs a woman, and he does it, and then he's lured down by a midget nun or something, and it's just filled with these sort of like classic Fellini gags, and it follows over the course of a year, and you get a little background about some of the characters, like the local prostitute character, and you get the family dynamic of again, going back to E. Vitelloni. One of the main character, Tita's uncles, is a typical Vitelloni. I think he wears like a little nylon on his head kind of thing. Was that I had mentioned that from what I've looked critically, a lot of people thought that this was, I guess, or it's seen now sort of maybe the last flowering of Fellini, making a film that got a chord, because the films that came afterward, from what I've read, and I've only seen Intervista, seem to have gone the way of like a lot of Bergman's last television films, that this was sort of watered down Fellini, that Amarcord was sort of the last flowering of Fellini at his best. Is that so, would you say? And how was that film received as well?
Well, that was his most successful film, probably.
Well, with the exception of La Dolce Vita.
Yeah, that's true.
There was a commercial, yes. Certainly late commercial, absolutely. Everything else was not commercially.
I mean, yeah, go ahead, Peter. You go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, I think it's way less, it is very commercially consumable. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's a lot less obviously commercial than we think. I mean, in other words, he's still got the touch. It's just that he actually, I think, goes back a little bit, and a little less, certainly less experimental than other ways. And he touches, I think, on what he always was, which was a comic director. I mean, the famous picture of him with the 8.5 with the camera, the Mitchell camera. Most people don't think of 8.5 as a comic film, but Fellini thought of it as comedy. And I think he really shows you what a great comic he always was with Amarcord, because that's why people like it, because it's funny. It's also serious. It's a very serious indictment of Italians, by the way.
Yeah.
It's what fashion was really all about. It was about conformism and doing the stupid thing and not taking responsibility. I mean, he really lets Italian. I mean, it's a very famous interview that I translated called, the fascism within us. Boy, I'd like to see somebody like Donald Trump be as self-critical of what's wrong with Americans as Fellini was with Italians. I mean, it's pretty. And then when he does the same thing with Casanova, it's even more critical. He didn't pull any punches on what's wrong with Italians. He really didn't.
And just as the '60s films I talk about were head trips, the '70s in Italy was a moment when Italian filmmakers started to do revisionist studies of fascism. I mean, she made 1900 and The Conformist and so forth. So it's interesting that Fellini shifts into this mode, which is really kind of the first time that Italian cinema at large really began to look at the experience of fascism. There was Lena Bergmüller's Seven Beauties, etc. So what Peter's saying about the seriousness of the film was very important, and it was part of a cultural seriousness that really emerged in the wake of the failure of 1968. Again, I think that Fellini thought in the '60s that everything was going to change, and then everything fell apart. So his filmmaking changes in a way to accommodate that, to take that into consideration. So I always see him in one way or another as a social commentator, even though that was not his intention. But he was plugged in, he was intuitive, and he had a strong sense of what was going on around him. And I think that Amicourt's really good again at this incredibly critical view of the Italian psychology that could lead to fascism. And again, as Peter says in Casanova, I think there were shifts in Fellini's filmmaking that came out of his profound sense of a world that had now dramatically changed after the 1960s.
Now, let's not forget that that's the era of terrorism in Italy, too.
Yes. Oh, great. Yes.
Really serious problems. I mean, we're not talking just a few terrorists. We're talking about government ministers' sons who were terrorists, who killed Carabinieri. I mean, those kind of people. Yeah. This was his business, you know. And of course, finally with the assassination of Aldo Moro, which is and all these judges and these. I mean, this is a pretty turbulent time in Italy, from the '70s through the '90s with the mafia and the terrorists. I mean, it's a wonder Italy held together, actually.
Yeah. No, it's terrible. Then, of course, the end of the '70s, he makes Orchestra Rehearsal in response to the kidnapping of Aldo Moro. So it's a decade in which his filmmaking, although it seems extravagant to many people, is still very much linked. And there's strong images of terrorism in City of Women as well.
Right. Well, look, I was sitting talking to a friend of mine in Florence in a little shop on Borgo San Jacopo in this period, in the terrorist period, with a general from the Carabinieri. The next day, he was killed in Rome. Can you imagine? I mean, that's pretty scary. And I had a student who was on one of the trains that were bombed in 1985. I mean, it
was everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and this was not funny. You know, this was so. You know, Fellini really did reflect these kinds of problems and in a way that people again don't give him much credit for, because he's not supposed to be a social commentator. But actually, he's the most. To me, Fellini is the most Italian of any director. He's the most. If you want to learn about Italian culture, don't necessarily look at Bertolucci. Look at Fellini. That's what I would.
Of these post-Amicourt films until the end of his career and his death, the only one that I've seen was Intervista. You've mentioned some of these other films. Were they films of general quality, or from what I've read, a lot of people, like I said, from what I've read critically, that they seem to echoes of better stuff, that he sort of fell into what might be called the old filmmaker syndrome. If you look at the last few films of Kurosawa versus his greater films too, Bergman too, his television films, were these films of quality? Because when I saw Intervista, frankly, that's a terrible film. I almost felt embarrassed watching it. But what about the rest of these films in the late '70s and '80s?
I think Intervista is one of his most brilliant films. I think it's a film because I think, again, it comes down to what people expect of his work. And I think as he moved into his later career, he was really interested in issues of not representing things, but talking about the way in which things get represented. I think Intervista is a constant transformation of our expectations of what we're going to see next and how we're going to see it. So to me, it's a film about sort of signification, or the way in which meaning is created. It's not a film that represents a world in any kind of conventional sense. But I also think that, for instance, if End the Ship Sailed Down had been Fellini's second film, it would have have been acknowledged as a masterpiece, and he would have been acknowledged as a brilliant new director. I think there's this kind of retrospective denigration that goes on with any artist, and so that Fellini is always being compared to his reputation instead of people looking at his films. I think And the Ship Sails On is a beautiful film. I think Intervista is a brilliant film. I think La Orchestra Rehearsal is a very important film, which actually has acquired some traction recently, I think. And even Ginger and Fred, some people have it on their top 10 film list. So this sort of notion that Fellini just fell apart at the end of his career, I don't agree with. I think there's unevenness. I think there's tremendous unevenness. And I think it has to do with the fact that I think he made something like 15 films in his first 20 years, and then he made like 8 films in his last 20 years. The inability to continually make films, I think, erodes sort of the intuitive coherence of the director at times. There were huge interruptions in the making of Fellini, Casanova, and City of Women. So I think there are factors that lead to problems in sort of the intuitive coherence of some of his work, but to dismiss all the films after Amarcord as insignificant or inferior, I think is a huge mistake.
Well, you mentioned his not making films at the clip he wanted to. Kurosawa famously, in the last 20 years or so, had a lot of difficulty getting funding from Toho and whatnot, and he needed Coppola and Lucas to help sort of do Kagamusha and Ron. So was Fellini sort of on the outs with Cinecittà? Was he sort of passé?
No,
Peter, it's hard for everybody to get money. I think it was hard for all these people who had their reputations made in the auteur period to get money. I mean, it's also extraordinarily embarrassing for a country like Italy to have financed some of the absolute crap that they financed and not give Fellini some money. I mean, it was just, it's embarrassing. I mean, what he was ending up doing at the end of his career was making commercials, which, by the way, are really brilliant commercials. Now, Frank has written on those, and the thing is that they really are really quite extraordinary commercials because, of course, he was against commercials interrupting cinema on the television. He hated that, the fact that you'd stop in the middle of a film that he'd made and sell some soap or something or some pasta. But when he made a cinema commercial, they were extraordinary, and it just showed he had the touch, but he didn't have the energy. I mean, remember he died very early. You got to remember Fellini came from a family of males. His younger brother died before he did. His father died very early. He was only 70-some years old when he died. And he was having incredible trouble getting money because basically the Italian film industry was in disarray, and the money from the government was never really given to Fellini very much. It was always given to some political connection. There's a very famous story about, where Craxi's brother, Craxi, the famous socialist, who was one of the most corrupt leaders of Italian post-war government, had a brother-in-law who wrote film criticism, and he went to Fellini, the brother-in-law, to ask for an introduction to his collected film criticism, which nobody read because it was in the socialist newspaper that nobody read. And Fellini refused to do it because he hated Craxi. He thought he was like a Mussolini figure that would, if Craxi had been, he once said if Craxi had been from, Emilia Romagna instead of Milan, he would have been another Mussolini because he was antipatico, fortunately. He came from... This was a time when Fellini actually could have had money. I mean, all the Fellini probably had to do was to write an introduction for that guy, and he would have had money from the Italian government, from Craxi. And Fellini refused to do it, which is one of his the most courageous things he probably ever did, because he really didn't, he did not, in any stretch of any imagination, ever kowtow to political power. He just didn't do it. He was a free man, And it cost him money. I mean, it cost him government subsidies. It really did.
And we go back to the early 70s, really. That's when Hollywood stops investing. Late 60s, early 70s, stops investing in Italy. And Hollywood's in crisis, and that creates a huge crisis within the Italian film industry, plus the oil crisis and the recession of the early 1970s. That's when funding began generally to fall apart. And the irony is that Fellini's moment of greatest sort of celebrity and visibility occurs at exactly the moment that he begins to stop getting money from making films.
let's talk about Fellini and influence, because he died in '93. But before I talk about any newer filmmakers who may have been influenced, I want to know: do you think that what Fellini's influence was on some of his contemporaries and peers? I'll give you an example. I've only seen a handful of Visconti's films, and he was he was sort of a Mr. Melodrama, his family melodramas and whatnot. But when I watch a film like The Damned, made I think in '68 or '69 by Visconti, to me it seems he was going for a very kind of over the top Fellini kind of take on the Nazis, and I guess it was The Night of the Long Knives is the famous scene in that film. Did do you think that Fellini, because of his persona and also his fame and his impact, did he have sort of a gravitational pull on some of his contemporaries, that they may have may have been influenced subconsciously or not by some of his work?
Like contemporaries, do you mean Italians or
Yeah,
Americans?
well, yeah, even beyond Italy too. I mean, either or.
Well, yeah, he had an enormous influence on Scorsese. I mean, look, Zampano and Lestrade becomes Raging Bull. That's the. I mean, he says it. He said, "I modeled, you know, I modeled the protagonist of Raging Bull in Scorsese film after Zampano." I mean, the introduction to Goodfellas and Mean Streets comes right out of the Vitelloni, the introduction of the characters. I mean, let's talk about musicals. Bob Fosse's Sweet Charity, Nine. Eight and a half, and what is it? All That Jazz. I mean, the list goes on. Spike Jonze adaptation. And he even talks about Fellini inventing the documentary and adaptation, which is a wonderful film, which is basically a version of Eight and a Half, and on and on and on and on. Has an enormous influence. Lena Wertmüller's Seven Beauties wouldn't exist without Eight and a Half. I mean, it's a really enormous influence.
Robert Altman, Wes Anderson, Tim Burton, David Lynch, Terry Gilliam, just the list goes on and on and on.
And actually, the Terry Gilliam was actually there making Baron Munchausen when Fellini was shooting, and they got to know each other. You know, so yeah. I mean, the people that really love Fellini are not the critics. They're the director. They're the people who love Fellini, because they know what making a film is all about. You know, that's why if you ever see one of those sight and sound polls, when you break it up between the critics and the directors, Fellini always gets this huge. Oh, Coppola, excuse me. What about the landlord pops up in the Godfather? You know, I mean that's right out of that's Leopoldo Trieste, right out of either out of Divorce Italian Style or out of the White Sheet. You know, so I mean it's an enormous from the standpoint of cinematic people who work in the cinema. Fellini is the man. The point of critics, that's another matter.
Do you think that there'll ever be a time in the near future, say, when there'll be another auteur period? Because if you look at Hollywood, and I've noticed in also European and other films from around the world, there seems to be this sort of growing dumbing down of film. Whereas in the '50s and '60s, in Japan, in Italy, in Bergman, and even the emergence of world film at that time, there seemed to be sort of a respect for the viewer as an intelligent being that just is utterly missing in Hollywood today, and even has been watered down, I think, in a lot of foreign films that are more geared to be released in the U.S. Do you think that Fellini and that sort of aesthetic, that idea that we can make adult films, not pornographic films, but adult films, films for adults, rather than, you know, Transformers 23 and Batman versus Superman kind of crap. Do you think that things are cyclical, and that we're going to see a return to the days when the Kurosawas and the Bergmans and the Fellinis were the big names, and everyone wanted to see what they did next?
I just think that Hollywood is just run by. First of all, to get a film made now, the whole financing process is so complicated. Plus, and
the advertising alone is so much money that nobody can. And Fellini never spent what, more than what, $10 million or something on a film. I mean, that's like a fraction of the advertising budget.
Yeah, no, and you have to prove that your film is going to be a success in advance. You have to pre-sell your film in order to get money to make the film. And with Fellini, who like Rossellini, to kind of create the film as he was shooting it, that makes it really, really difficult. I mean, Hitchcock did storyboard everything ahead of time, so not all the great directors have worked in the same way. But I just think the conditions of financing pretty much eliminate the possibility of a great deal of originality. And then the audience, as you say, Dan, is reduced to this kind of set of Pavlovian responses. And what you're trying to do is get them to laugh again at what they laughed at before, or just be excited by one more special effect that they haven't seen before. But there is really no sense of seriousness about films that really investigate the world we live in. So I'm pretty well. Of course, it's a function of my age, but I'm pretty.
Right. You're told to see the New Horizon.
Well, I've been buoyed by seeing in the last decade in Turkey Nuri Bilge Ceylan's films, and also the first few films from Steve McQueen in Britain. Do you think that maybe a European-based and American-financed independent films might be a way to go again, as they were, as you mentioned, in the 50s and 60s?
Yeah, and also, I mean, the European films that are based on collaborations among different television. I mean, one of the things that's produced some good work in the past few years has been television. Now, television is sort of receding in the face of the internet, but when you get films that are produced by 4 or 5 European television networks, I think that of course it limits the kind of film that's going to be made, because it has to have kind of a televisual structure, and it has to have stars from each of the countries involved, and it has to be perceived as being able to appeal to audiences in all 5 countries involved. So there are all sorts of limitations there, but at least there probably is great respect for inventiveness and creativity than there is in the conventional Hollywood model.
I must say, without actually knowing anything much about this particular problem, just right now I don't have access to Netflix, but I certainly have it home. And I must say, some of the foreign television shows that have been shown on Netflix were really, quite good. I mean, they were, I thought, rather high quality, like French police films and Danish, mysteries. I mean, there's strange things you see now on Netflix that you never would have seen earlier. So there is some hope that there'll be some kind of variety on things, because they have this enormous appetite for, they need product,
Yeah, that's good.
That's the good part about the new era, I think. That these people are dying. I mean, there's Hulu, there's Criterion, there's Netflix, there's Amazon, there's everybody and his brother that's trying to get their hands on stuff. And so it may actually be that in the long run, there's more production. And out of that, that maybe the percentage of it won't be great, but some of it will be. And I think I've already, just by accident, you stumble on these things. Oh, let's look at it. And some weird thing you've never heard of actually turns out to be pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, cable TV had that effect with television. The quality of television programs now is way, way higher than it was before. So, no, I think it's a great and encouraging point.
Well, let's end this segment.
It's like how many Mozarts and Shakespeare's can you have? I mean, it's not like you're going to have 500 at a time. You're lucky to have one.
Mass-produced Shakespeare.
Yeah. Well, let's end this segment and wrap up the interview in our final segment, just talking about your final thoughts about Fellini, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Peter Bondinello and Frank Burke about the life of Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini. I want to give them a couple of minutes just to wrap up their thoughts. And generally what I like to do is for people, especially who may just be coming to the works of Fellini, as well as for people who have seen them over and again, if maybe you could give maybe a recommendation of 1, 2, or 3 films maybe that are essential to getting into the works of Fellini. So Peter, if you could give your final thoughts maybe, and then Frank.
Well, I'd say if you want to make a list of 5 films, let's start with, The White Sheet for an early film, either La Strada or The Knights of Cabiria, Dolce Vita, 8.5, and Amarcord. That leaves out a lot of things, but it also puts in the big time things that really, really. I actually put the Satyricon in as well. It's hard to leave things out, actually. But what I would recommend is that you need to come to Fellini with an open mind, first of all. I mean, he is not making commercial Hollywood type films. He's doing something quite different. If you're looking for car chases and explosions, this is the wrong guy to frequent. On the other hand, if you're looking for expanding your consciousness, for expanding your vision, for understanding what beautiful scenography and wonderful photography and very expert craftsmanship making something that's really gorgeous and worthwhile, then you've got somebody that will stay with you for the rest of your life. It certainly stayed with me. I mean, I've spent my entire life thinking and looking at Fellini and thinking about him and wondering what his influence is. And I have to say, it hasn't been completely wasted life in that sense. Like many other things I've done at the same time have been, I might add. And I'm sure that Frank feels the same way.
Oh yeah, I do. And your list of films, I think, is perfect. I wouldn't add. I think for getting people started, I think that's exactly what they should see. One of the things that I'm interested in with Fellini is the extent to which he was a major cultural figure. And the influence he had, not just on filmmakers, but I would need to do more exploration of this within an Italian context, but also an American context. To what extent he's influenced musicians, painters, graphic designers, and I think that's sort of an invisible influence that he's had, and I really hope that gets explored. One of the things coming up is 2020 will be the 100th anniversary of his birth, and I think there will be a lot of activity around Fellini as we move to that moment, and I'm hoping at that point that he becomes revisited not just as a filmmaker, but as a figure who's influenced culture, Western culture, in a whole bunch of different ways. So sort of summing up, and I think the last thing I would say is sort of echo something that Peter said too, is that Fellini's been very important. He's been with me since I've been 22 years old or whatever, and I don't think that's been a bad thing.
Well, below this video, I'll have some links to Felliniana that people can explore further some of the works of Fellini. Tomorrow, I'll be talking with the son of American writer Irwin Shaw about his life and career as well. So I want to thank both Peter and Frank for your time.
Thank you. It's been a lot of